Okay, this is chapter 19 on the lymphatic system and lymphoid organs and lymphoid tissues. So the lymphatic system is going to be kind of the intermediate between the cardiovascular system and the immune system. So the functions of the lymphatic system include returning leaked fluids from the blood vessels back into circulation. So it's composed of three general parts. So we have our network of lymphatic vessels that are going to run kind of alongside or parallel to the main arteries and veins. So if you think of the arteries and veins as like the major highways, then the lymphatic vessels would be more like the back roads. Lymph is the term to refer to the fluid that's in the vessel. So think of like plasma fluid from the blood circulation that leaks into the tissue spaces, becomes interstitial fluid. So that fluid, once it's taken up into the lymphatic vessels, is just referred to as lymph. And then the lymph nodes are the primary organs of the lymphatic system that are going to kind of filter and clean that fluid before we return it back into circulation. So these lymphoid organs and tissues provide the structural basis of our immune system because they're going to house a lot of our phagocytic cells and lymphocytes. So a lot of our immune cells are going to live within these lymphatic organs and tissues. So some lymphatic organs and structures we'll look at include the spleen, the thymus, tonsils, lymph nodes, of course, and then a few other lymphoid tissues. So like we said, the lymphatic system is just going to return any leaked interstitial fluid and those plasma proteins back to the blood via these lymphatic vessels. Okay? And again, once the fluid enters the lymphatic system, it's referred to as lymph. So lymphatic vessels are going to have a one-way system. So the fluid is only going to travel one way back toward the heart. So they're going to travel kind of alongside the venous system and returning that fluid to the circulation in the heart. So lymphatic vessels include lymphatic capillaries that are going to be kind of intertwined throughout the normal capillary bed so they can kind of sop up any of that excess leaked fluid. And then as we leave the capillary space and enter into the larger lymphatic vessels as we get closer to the heart. So lymphatic capillaries are similar to blood capillaries, but with a few differences. One being that they're more permeable, so they're going to be able to take up the fluid and proteins more easily. Like I said, they're going to kind of weave between our normal capillary networks. So we don't have lymphatic capillaries everywhere in the body. A few places where they're absent include bones, teeth, bone marrow, and the central nervous system. So remember from Anatomy 1, the central nervous system is going to use that cerebrospinal fluid to drain and clean its fluids. So because these lymphatic capillaries are more permeable than normal blood capillaries, they can take up larger molecules and particles that normal blood capillaries cannot. So things like proteins, cells, pathogens. But this also means that they can serve as a route for these pathogens or cancer cells to travel throughout the body. So when you hear of a cancer that has metastasized, that's generally meaning that it's entered into the lymphatic system and traveled to different locations throughout the body. So still looking at lymphatic capillaries. So we said they have an increased permeability compared to blood capillaries, and this is due to a couple of specialized structures. So the first being that their endothelial cells are going to kind of just loosely overlap one another to form these one-way mini valves, so a flap-like mini valve. So this means the fluid can only go inside the capillary, but it can't come back out. And these mini valves are going to be anchored by collagen filaments. So increases in the extracellular fluid volume is able to open kind of increase the pressure to open these valves even more, right? So then vice versa, if there's less fluid pressure outside the capillaries, so we don't have as much fluid pressure pushing open the valves, then they will remain closed. Lacteals are another type of specialized lymphatic capillary that are only found in the intestines. Okay? So they're going to help us absorb and digest fat and deliver that into the blood. So as you take in food, right, so it's going to be kind of processed and filtered through the liver, and then before it's absorbed, right, it's going to enter into these lacteal capillaries before we enter it into circulation. So again, this is because we just want to filter and clean that fluid, that substance of any potential bacteria or pathogens before we allow it into the systemic circulation. So one of the easiest ways for pathogens to get into the body is through our food and digestive system. So the larger lymphatic vessels is going to be where these lymphatic capillaries eventually drain into, right, to these collecting vessels. So we have collecting vessels, trunks, and ducts. So structurally, they are similar to veins, meaning that they have thin walls and they kind of converge more frequently. And again, they're going to travel kind of alongside the venous system and the veins. So some of the larger lymphatic vessels include things like the lymphatic trunks. So these are formed by union of our larger collecting vessels that are going to drain the major large areas of the body. And they're named for the general body region that they're going to drain or service. So we have a pair of lumbar lymphatic trunks, brachio, mediastinal, subclavian, jugular, and intestinal. So all these come in pairs with the exception of the intestinal, which is just a single collecting vessel, single lymphatic trunk. So the lymph fluid is going to travel from the trunks into one of two large lymphatic ducts. So the right lymphatic duct here is going to drain fluid from the right upper arm and right side of the head and thorax. Right? So kind of this general region here. The thoracic duct here, so it's a little bit lower, it's going to drain virtually the rest of the body fluid. So and in about half individuals starts out as an enlarged sac of the cisterna chyli. So this is just where it's going to kind of converge all this fluid and empty into that thoracic duct. So eventually, though, both of the lymphatic ducts are going to empty into the venous circulation, right, at the jugular and subclavian veins. Right? So the lymph fluid has been filtered and cleaned, so we can now return it to the systemic circulation through the venous system. So again, just like a general overview of the lymphatic system, all the vessels and major structures. So again, the right lymphatic duct is going to drain all of this region highlighted in green, and your thoracic duct is going to drain fluid from pretty much the rest of the body, shown in pink. So another similarity between the lymphatic system and the venous system is that they were both low pressure systems. Right? So this means they're also going to have similar adaptations to kind of overcome that low pressure system to make sure the fluid is returned all the way to the heart. So things like the milking action of the skeletal muscles. So as skeletal muscles contract, they're going to squeeze the fluid up past the valves toward the heart. Same thing with pressure changes during breathing. So we're squeezing those vessels and that fluid We had those valves to ensure that one-way flow so we don't have any backflow of fluid. Also, pulsation of nearby arteries can help to kind of squeeze and push fluid forward, and contractions of smooth muscle in the lymphatic vessels. Right, so then that would mean physical activity would increase flow of lymph fluid, whereas lack of activity or immobilization would slow down healing because we don't have as much of a flow of that fluid, so it becomes kind of stagnated. So this could cause something like lymphedema. So it's basically swelling, accumulation of lymph fluid. So something is preventing normal return of that lymph fluid to the blood. So it could be something like tumor, but essentially the fluid accumulates and causes swelling and edema in that body region. Okay, so looking at some cells involved in the lymphatic system. So these are going to be primarily things like immune cells and supporting cells. Okay? So the immune system cells involved with the lymphatic system include the lymphocytes. Right? So lymphocytes are in the lymphatic system, but they're also in the immune system. So like we said, the lymphatic system is kind of the connection or the bridge between the cardiovascular system and the immune system. So in the next chapter, the immune system, chapter 20, we'll talk more in depth about lymphocytes, but for now, just know they are part of the adaptive immune system, and they become either a T cell or a B cell. So these lymphocytes, these T cells and B cells, are going to work to help protect our bodies against antigens. Right? So an antigen is short for antibody generating. So basically anything the body perceives as foreign that's going to trigger an immune response. So things like bacteria, viruses, mismatched blood transfusions, cancer cells, right, will all be detected by these immune system cells. So even though they're both lymphocytes, they have slightly different roles to play in the immune response. So T cells are going to kind of generally manage the overall immune response as well as attack and destroy infected cells, whereas B cells are going to produce what's called a plasma cell that's going to secrete antibodies. So antibodies don't directly kill infected cells themselves. All they really do is tag those foreign antigens for destruction. So other cells, like T cells, know which cells to kill and which cells to leave alone. So T cells, again, attack infected cells. B cells are going to attack outside of the cell, so things on the surface of the cell. So a few other cells involved in the lymphatic system. You have macrophages. So these are just the large eating cells. So they're going to eat any foreign substances and also help activate and stimulate some of those T cells. So if a macrophage encounters, say, a bacteria, right, it can take that bacteria out and then alert the T cell that there's potential infection taking place. Dendritic cells are going to, again, capture those antigens and deliver them to the T cells to turn them on, to activate them, to alert the immune system and the lymphocytes that there's potential infections. And they're called dendritic cells because they look kind of like dendrites in the nervous system. And then a supporting lymphoid cell that doesn't really have a direct role in immunity or protection are the reticular cells. So these are more kind of structural. There's going to form the stroma, or kind of the scaffolding structure of the lymphoid organs. So some other functions of lymphoid tissue include providing a house for these lymphocytes as well as a place for them to proliferate or divide and multiply. It's also going to serve as a surveillance vantage point for these lymphocytes and macrophages because remember the lymphatic system is going to filter the lymph fluid before we return it to circulation. So any pathogens, bacteria, whatever that are in that fluid, right, will pretty much just be delivered to these immune cells in the lymph nodes, right, as they travel through the lymphatic system. So lymphoid tissue is largely composed of a reticular connective tissue, which is a type of loose connective tissue. So we have lots of spaces between the fibers for these immune cells to kind of occupy when they return from their patrolling duty. So again, showing, so we have our reticular fibers and then all kind of this empty space, all these rooms available for our lymphatic cells. So lymphoid organs are grouped into two main functional categories. So our primary lymphoid organs are where the lymphocytes are going to mature. So the T cells and the B cells are going to mature in the bone marrow and the thymus. Right? So these are our two primary lymphoid organs because they're going to be the site of development for our lymphocytes. So without our healthy lymphocytes, we wouldn't have a functioning lymphatic system. Okay? So remember from the blood chapter, all blood cells originate from the bone marrow. Right? So T cells and B cells are types of leukocytes or types of white blood cells. So the only difference between the two is that after T cells have formed from the bone marrow, they're going to travel to the thymus where they will finish their development. B cells will remain in the bone marrow until they reach maturity. Right? So T cells, T for thymus, B cells, B for bone marrow. So then the secondary lymphoid organs are pretty much everything else. So things like the lymph nodes, the spleen, the tonsils. So this is going to be areas where these mature T cells and B cells are now going to function and encounter antigens or pathogens and become activated to trigger an immune response. So lymph nodes are the principal secondary lymphoid organ of the body. So we have hundreds of lymph nodes all throughout, mostly embedded in the deeper tissues and kind of in clusters. Okay? So the major regions or clusters of lymph nodes include the inguinal region, so kind of the groin region, axillary, so the armpit region, cervical regions of the neck. So this would be where a lot of those collecting vessels are going to converge into trunks. Okay, so looking at the structure and function of a lymph node. So two main functions of lymph nodes primarily would be to cleanse and filter that lymph fluid. So macrophages are going to live within the lymph node. So as the lymph fluid passes through, they kind of swim through and eat and clean anything that may be in that fluid. So again, we want to clean and filter the fluid before it's returned to the blood circulation. Another function of lymph nodes would be immune system activation. So if, say, the cells in the lymph node do encounter any pathogens in the lymph fluid, we can alert the rest of the immune system to activate it and mount an attack before it becomes a more severe or systemic infection. So lymph nodes structurally can vary in size, but generally most are kind of small and bean-shaped, about 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch. They're surrounded by an external fibrous capsule, which is going to help support the overall structure and stability of the organ. So capsule fibers that extend inward are going to form what's called trabeculae that just divides the node into different compartments. So histologically, looking at the cellular level, the different types of cells within the lymph node, there are two regions. So we have the cortex, which would be the outer region, and then the medulla is the mid portion. So looking at the cortex, we said it was the outer or the superficial region. So the cortex is going to contain these germinal centers that are filled with developing and dividing B cells. Right? So germinal, think germinate. If you germinate a seed, you're sprouting the seed. Right? So here we're germinating and sprouting B cells. Okay? So deeper in the cortex, you may find some T cells that are kind of circulating along with the blood and the lymph fluid. And also a lot of dendritic cells may be present in the lymph node. So the dendritic cells we'll talk more about in the immune system chapter, but they do play important roles in activating both T cells and B cells. And again, the medulla was the kind of the inner portion, the middle portion of the lymph node that's going to extend from the cortex. So there are B cells and T cells and plasma cells generally found within the medulla. Right? So again, the plasma cells are what produce the antibodies. Lymph sinuses found throughout the node. So these are just going to contain some larger lymphatic capillaries. And contain some macrophages to, again, kind of check for any pathogenic or foreign matter. So just showing a microscopic picture of a lymph node. So you can see the follicles within the cortex, right? That's going to house our dividing and germinating B cells, and then the medullary sinuses within the medulla, and then your capsule, so that thick fibrous connective tissue covering. So looking at circulation within the lymph node, so lymphatic fluid is going to enter the lymph node via the afferent vessels, right? So A for arriving. So the fluid arrives through the afferent vessels. Right? So then from there, it's going to travel through the subcapsular sinus and then on to some of the smaller sinuses found throughout the cortex in the medulla. So finally, after it's been fully processed and made its way all through the sinuses and the lymph node, it's going to exit the lymph node at the hilum, or kind of this little pinched region inside, via the efferent vessels, right? So we exit through the efferent. Okay? So if you notice, there are much fewer efferent vessels than afferent. So that means fluid is coming in faster than it can leave. So this is going to slow down the flow a bit once it reaches inside the lymph node. So we kind of get a traffic jam. So think you're driving on the highway and we go from a 5-lane to a 2-lane, right? So traffic's really going to slow down and somewhat stagnate. So it'll be kind of just circulating around for a while. But this is what we want. So we want the macrophages and the lymphocytes to have plenty of time to thoroughly kind of pick through all of this fluid and make sure we didn't miss any potential pathogens. So one type of imbalance we could see with lymph nodes would be what are called buboes. So this would be just inflamed, swollen, and tender lymph nodes. Generally when the lymph nodes become overwhelmed by whatever they're trying to destroy. So sometimes it's referred to as simply swollen glands. So sometimes if you get sick, you can feel kind of your lymph nodes are a little swollen and tender around your neck. Sometimes they can also become pus-filled. So if you've ever heard of the bubonic plague, so it was named after kind of the major symptom of this disease, which would be the buboes or the inflamed lymph nodes. So continuing to look at some lymphatic organs, we're looking at the spleen. So the spleen is located the left side of the abdominal cavity, just kind of below behind the stomach. It's about the size of your fist. But of all of the lymphatic organs, it is the largest. Okay. So functions of the spleen include sites of lymphocyte proliferation, immune surveillance and response. It also serves other functions of kind of cleaning and recycling old red blood cells and platelets, and it contains macrophages to kind of clean up the cellular debris. So some additional functions of the spleen, not necessarily related to its role in the lymphatic system, but we did talk about it a little bit in the blood chapter. So again, it's going to store those recycled, broken down products of red blood cells for later reuse. So things like the iron from the hemoglobin we can recycle and reuse. It can store platelets and monocytes for release into the blood as needed. And it may serve as the site of fetal erythrocyte production. So fetuses, as they're developing, they don't have fully formed bone or bone marrow, right? So they start with that hyaline cartilage kind of template skeleton. So since blood cells come from the bone marrow, right, so the spleen kind of takes over the role of blood cell production until that bone marrow is fully formed. So histologically, it's composed of two different parts. So we have a white pulp kind of in the middle of the organ, and then the red pulp kind of along the edge. So the white pulp would be the site of immune function. So think white blood cells, immune cells, right? So white pulp, it's going to contain mostly those lymphocytes, and they cluster around the central arteries. So it's called white pulp because it appears kind of like a white tissue in this red spleen organ. So then the red pulp would be where the old blood cells and pathogens are destroyed. So it's very rich in red blood cells, so give it this red color. Okay. It's also going to be composed of splenic cords, which are basically just reticular tissue, kind of scaffolding tissue that's going to help separate these splenic sinusoids, right, or these blue venous sinuses in the spleen. Some other lymphatic tissue is the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT. So this is lymphoid tissue that's found in mucous membranes throughout the body. So remember, mucous membranes are going to line our open body cavities, so things like the respiratory tract, the digestive tract, basically anywhere where it would be easier for pathogens to enter the body. Okay. So the largest collections of this MALT tissue are found in the tonsils and the pyroid patches and appendix in the intestines. So tonsils are the simplest of the lymphoid organs. They're very small, and they just form a basic ring of lymphatic tissue around the pharynx or the throat. So there's a few different types, and they're just named for their location. So the palatine tonsils, right, are located near the posterior end of the oral cavity, so near the palate. So these are the largest tonsils and the ones that are typically removed in childhood. Lingual tonsils at the base of the tongue, so lingual just means tongue. Pharyngeal tonsil, or the adenoids, located in the posterior wall of the nasopharynx, so kind of where the nose and the throat meet. And then tubal tonsils surround the openings of the auditory tubes. So we pretty much have these tonsils at every major entrance to the body. So if something comes through the nose, right, it's going to encounter the pharyngeal tonsils. If something tries to come either through the ear or in this region we'll have a tubal tonsil. Something that we swallow or take in through the mouth is going to encounter the lingual and the palatine tonsils. So our hope is that we can stop whatever it is kind of at the front door before it gets deeper down into the body and spreads. Yeah, so tonsils' function is just to gather and remove those pathogens from the food and air. So they're also going to contain a lot of those germinal centers, germinal follicles, with some lymphocytes. So unlike the lymph nodes, they're not encapsulated. So they have an overlying thin epithelial tissue that's going to invaginate, meaning it's going to form these tonsillar crypts where it kind of just cuts down. So we have these deep crypts that are going to help to trap bacteria. Right? So bacteria get kind of trapped and accumulated in these tonsillar crypts, which can lead to formation of things like tonsil stones. Peyer's patches are found in the wall of the small intestine. So they're essentially just lymphoid nodules along the intestinal wall. So they're similar to tonsils. So their location is going to aid in their function. So they destroy any bacteria that may try to get into the bloodstream or breach the intestinal wall. And they can also generate some memory lymphocytes. So if we encounter that same bacteria again, we already have those memory cells for it, so we remember which antibodies to make or how to attack that infection. So the appendix is also going to be a lymphatic organ of the digestive system, so it's going to come off of the beginning of the large intestine. Okay? So it contains a lot of those lymphoid follicles. It has similar functions to the Peyer's patches, so it's going to help trap and destroy bacteria and pathogens and keep them from getting through the intestinal wall or into the bloodstream. And they can also generate memory lymphocytes. So the appendix is considered a vestigial organ, meaning that we don't really need it to survive. Right? We don't really use it as much anymore. So that's why it's kind of small and shriveled, just really puny little organ here. But since it is kind of like a prison for pathogens and bacteria that kind of are just stored and locked away in here, if it becomes inflamed or ruptures, then all of those pathogens and bacteria and things are now going to be free to infect the rest of the body and in the abdominal cavity. So the thymus is another lymphatic organ we said was one of the primary organs. Right? So it's located in the inferior neck region. So the thymus is where T cells mature. Okay? So it's going to be most active and largest in childhood. So during adolescence, through adulthood, it's going to gradually atrophy or kind of shrivel up and become pretty much inactive. Okay? So the reason that adults don't really have active thymuses is because our immune system is already developed, right? So the thymus only role is to serve as a place for the immune cells, the T cells, to mature. So children, their immune systems are still developing, so they need that thymus to develop and mature their immune cells. But as adults, our immune systems are pretty well established at this point, so the thymus isn't as necessary. So histologically, we can look at the structure of the thymus. So it's similar to the lymph nodes, so it has a cortex and like a medulla. So the outer cortex is going to contain our dividing lymphocytes. So those developing, dividing T cells, right? And then some scattered macrophages. The medulla contains less lymphocytes and what are called thymic corpuscles or Hassal's corpuscles. Right? So this is where the regulatory T cells develop. Right? So it's just a specific type of T cell that we'll talk about in the next chapter, but their main function is just to help regulate other aspects of the immune response and to help prevent autoimmunity. Right? So to keep the immune response from getting a little overzealous, the regulatory T cells kind of rein it in a bit so we don't have an autoimmune disorder. So the thymus is a little bit different from the other lymphoid organs we've talked about in a few important ways. So first of all, it has no follicles, right? Because the follicles, those germinating follicles, germinal centers, are where the B cells develop, right? So B cells aren't found in the thymus, so we don't need any follicles. Another difference of the thymus is that it doesn't directly fight antigens. So the other lymphoid organs had lymphoid cells that work to filter the lymph fluid to kind of attack pathogens, prevent infections. The function of the thymus is only for T cell maturation. And also the stroma, or kind of the scaffolding, the general structure of the organ is made up of epithelial cells instead of those reticular fibers.